U.S. President Barack Obama sanctions Russia, blaming Moscow for intending to influence the U.S. election. How much have elections in Africa changed the political landscape? We'll discuss the issue. And an exhaustive collection of traditional and popular African music goes digital. Africa 54 starts right now.
Good evening and welcome. I'm Vincent Makori. This is Africa 54. U.S. President Barack Obama is sanctioning Russia, blaming Moscow for computer hacks intended to influence the November election. But President-elect Donald Trump says he does not believe Russia did it. How sure are cyber crime investigators when they point the finger at a suspect? As viewers, Steve Baragona reports, it's part science and part art.
Cyberspace is a 24-hour battleground of bots, viruses, and malware. But in this faceless world, it's hard to know who your attacker is.
This is a profile of the fancy bear actors.
Dmitry Alperovich is co-founder of the cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike. The company's software scanned for hackers at the Democratic National Committee this spring.
And right away, it lit up like a Christmas tree, basically telling us that there are two intrusion actors inside the DNC operating independently.
CrowdStrike named both intruders as Russian hacker groups with close ties to the Kremlin. Alperovich says reaching that conclusion was a lot like police work.
Just like when you arrive at a crime scene and you find a fingerprint, you want to run through your database to see does it match to any known criminals you may already know about, and look at other evidence. Does the MO look like some other bank robbery that you've already investigated?
CrowdStrike's investigation found a familiar bit of code. That code had turned up in other hacks blamed on these same Russian groups.
Once you build a weapon, you don't just want to use it once. The temptation is too great to keep on using it, and that's what often gives away these attacks.
The weapon is one clue. How it was used is another. CrowdStrike looked for patterns of activity in previous hacks.
And on the internet, nothing ever disappears, so you can go back through history and look at 10 years and thousands of attacks.
Finding other clues to a hacker's identity can be as simple as checking the clock, says Nick Rossman at the computer security firm FireEye via Skype.
When we see Russian activity, we often see that the malware is compiled in time zones that are similar to Moscow and St. Petersburg. And the same goes for Chinese cyber threat activity. We also look for when a threat actor is actively on a network. They often work from 9 to 5.
But skeptics note that a timestamp is not a smoking gun, and anyone can copy another hacker's code. Unlike DNA at a murder scene, there is rarely indisputable proof of cybercrimes. Rossman acknowledges the evidence is largely circumstantial.
We can't say for sure that we could set up a case that would stand under the court of law, but we believe that the wider scope of the evidence can help to make that argument.
Rossman agrees with CrowdStrike's conclusion that the Russians hacked the DNC, but in the anonymity of cyberspace, experts say the shadowy world of espionage is murkier still. Steve Baragona, VOA News, Washington.
Well, it was a relatively stormy 2016 in Africa, but there were also some silver linings on the continent. For a brief review of the year that was, here's VOA's Paul Sisko.
October 13th, 21 of more than 200 kidnapped Chibok schoolgirls are freed. They've been held by Boko Haram militants in Nigeria, near the Cameroon border, since April 2014. The UN and others report IDPs, internally displaced persons, reached an all-time high in 2016, and more refugees and migrants died or disappeared in 2016 than in any previous year. As a measure of democratic progress on the continent, there were more than 23 major elections slated for 2016 in Africa, a part of the world where democracy has struggled to take hold. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, where President Joseph Kabila appears willing to hang on to power at all costs. Gambia is on the verge of turmoil. Longtime leader Yahya Jammeh was upset at the polls on December 1st by Adama Barrow. More surprising was Jammeh's initial willing acceptance of the vote. Jammeh declared the vote fraudulent and unacceptable. He's now asking the Electoral Commission for a new vote. Despite last year's peaceful election and transition of power in the Central African Republic, UN monitors say violent clashes are spreading throughout the country. The recently released UN report says the new government has limited control outside the capital, Bangui. Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni won an unprecedented fifth term in disputed elections in February. Since he came to power in 1986, opposition parties have gained a growing share of seats in parliament. But the 2016 electoral process was marred by the arrest of Kizza Besigye and charges of voter irregularities. In Ghana, Nana Akufo-Addo will be inaugurated as the West African nation's new president, January 7th. He defeated incumbent President John Mahama of the National Democratic Congress in a peaceful vote December 7th. Zambia's incumbent President Edgar Lungu took the oath of office in September after the nation's top court rejected an opposition petition to block it. Also of note in 2016, a growing movement to withdraw from the ICC. The International Criminal Court was established as the court of last resort to prosecute crimes against humanity. It's accused of racism, focusing on African crimes, and the African Union has urged all its members to pull out. Another ominous 2016 record, a recent report from the UN says armed forces and groups in South Sudan recruited 1,300 child soldiers this year, bringing the total number of children used in fighting since 2013 to more than 17,000. Outgoing UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon again called for a Security Council vote on an arms embargo for South Sudan, saying he fears genocide is imminent unless immediate action is taken there. Paul Cisco, VOA News, Washington.
Well, thank you, Paul. Now, the United Nations Refugee Agency says more than 5,000 migrants, including many Africans, are believed to have drowned in the Mediterranean Sea in 2016. UNHCR spokesman William Spindler says the alarming increase in deaths this year appeared to be related to bad weather, the declining quality of vessels used by smugglers, and their tactics to avoid detection. The UNHCR appealed to states to open up more legal pathways for admitting refugees, resettlement programs, private sponsorships, family reunification, and student scholarships would help so they do not have to resort to dangerous journeys and the use of smugglers. The International Organization for Migration says nearly 360,000 migrants and refugees had entered Europe by sea by December 21st of 2016, arriving mostly in Greece and Italy. Now, for more perspective on this and other stories that made the headlines, I'm joined by my colleague Salem Solomon and Jackson Mvunganyi, who will be with us throughout the entire program today. Now, first, really, the three of us spent a lot of time discussing the issue of migrants trying to get to Europe. Salem, if I may begin with you, why do you think this stayed at the very top of the headlines on the continent?
As you introduced it in your introduction, because of the tragedy. It's been the biggest human tragedy of the past year, topping over 5,000 migrants, the death toll of migrants over 5,000. In fact, IOM is saying that 7,189 migrants, including refugees, are either missing or dead just this past year. So the magnitude of the death toll really highlights why this story continues to be on top of...
I agree with her. I agree totally with Salem. We've talked about this before, and I think one of the reasons why this story continues to make headlines is the staggering number of people that continue to die on these waters as they cross over to Europe, and that we hoped that by talking about it and highlighting some of these issues that we would see a decline in numbers for whatever reason. In the story they said one of the reasons why people are crossing over to Europe was because of changing weather patterns, or they're fleeing with droughts and things of that nature. But honestly, it's 2016. People shouldn't be fleeing because of weather changes.
But also, I think one of the other reasons why this story really stayed with us is that throughout the year, we really didn't see any realistic resolution to the problem.
Right.
That's
true. There were all ideas floated. There were things on the table in Europe. They had conferences. But, Salem, we didn't see, especially from the continent, any real kind of plan to resolve the problem.
That's right. I want to bring a little bit of perspective of what Europe is trying to do to curb the migration problem. In spring 2015, European Union had an emergency meeting to talk about how to curb migration coming from African countries. And so they had a 10-point action plan where they talked about how to invest, talking about pouring money into the problem, basically. One example we can think about just this past year, is Niger got over 600 million euros just to make sure that the migrants and refugees don't cross the Mediterranean. This is just one example. Other examples we can think of go as far as countries in Ethiopia, for instance, where second and third countries where migrants pass through. And so they would create like agricultural or other industries so that migrants would have jobs in order not to, in order to make sure that unemployment doesn't cause, or economic reasons doesn't cause, migrants or refugees to leave.
Very quickly
these
before we
spaces.
move from this, Jackson, do you fear that this problem will persist because there's no realistic resolution?
Absolutely. The AU and other member countries have not really spoken frankly about the causes of why these people continue to take, to risk their lives to flee to Europe, to go to Europe. And so unless they start having those conversations, realistic conversations, honest conversations amongst themselves, member bodies, why is Europe having meetings about Africans coming to on their continent without the role of the African Union? Where is the African Union voice? Why isn't the African Union being at the forefront of resolving this crisis?
Exactly. I mean, the fact that people can risk dying, sometimes they know they will probably not make it, but they have to leave. And there has to be a compelling reason, right?
We've talked about the push factors. What are some of the push factors? Exactly. Why is it that people are willing to take the risk?
You know what? We're just kind of highlighting a bit of this. We'll continue with that conversation another time. But right now to the political crisis in South Sudan. In mid-December, South Sudanese President Salva Kiir asked his nation's citizens to forgive him for past mistakes. Kiir also ordered government forces to observe a ceasefire and create a conducive environment for communities to reconcile. However, the country remains tense, and human rights organizations warn of a possible genocide. Now, let's continue this conversation here. Another really tragic kind of story went on and on and on. And Salam, again, why? Why did we have to have this big story going on, running throughout the year?
Unfortunately, the continent's youngest country has had another tumultuous year. South Sudan had a peace agreement, an ongoing peace agreement that fell short last July. It seems like leadership is falling behind, and South Sudan didn't have a lot of infrastructure to begin with. You hear stories of hospitals that were built just after independence being demolished because of the war, and so very little infrastructure is under scrutiny, taking the country decades backwards, and so you see a very sad tumultuous
and kind of a
year
combination of all that. There's the violence, the lack of infrastructure. The country never had an opportunity to develop.
It's so sad that we rooted for South Sudan. We rooted for it. We were there when they're forming this new government. It felt like a baby to all of us.
Exactly.
And it's so sad that the main protagonists in these fights are people who enjoy, lavish lifestyles. We know the report that came out a couple of months ago talking about some of the money that has been, some of the resources that have been planted by both sides in the conflict. These people live comfortable lifestyles when millions of people are dying and suffering in South Sudan, and they continue to suffer because there's no interest whatsoever on both sides to come to an agreement.
And these leaders, they have been accused of actually having their families live in other countries. Absolutely. They live outside of South Sudan.
While over 2+ million people are internally displaced or going to other countries. I also want to mention international efforts. International efforts are also falling short. All these peacekeeping missions are not really materializing. And so you see the country taking a step backward.
But sometimes you wonder, is there some kind of fatigue, frustration from the international community? Because, Jackson, I've spoken to so many of these leaders from both sides. All they do is to blame each other. but you don't feel like
at the end of the day, the
trying to solve the
international
problem.
community can do so much. If there's no willingness within the country itself, within the major players, within the leadership of either the rebels or the people at the, in the presidency, Salva Kiir, if there's no willingness to come to the table and talk peace, the people will continue to suffer.
And the international community has limited.
The international community can do so little, really.
If I would like to add, what really worries me about South Sudan is how these grievances have come in ethnic lines. And so the majority, Dinka and Nuer, are, of course, on top and news. But the fact that these the fights against each other based on ethnicity is something to really take a closer look at and to be worried about in the coming
and that's
years.
a very critical point. Actually, I wanted to bring it up, that once it takes an ethnic dimension, which South Sudanese are saying it has actually, it becomes very difficult to resolve. But again, some say the leadership is more about the ego of men, just a few men, and the people are just collateral damage, right?
Right. I mean, remember, this conflict has two major players. Riek Machar, who is right now in South Africa. I don't know under what circumstances. South Africa said they were really holding him there. I don't know whether they're detaining him. Salva Kiir obviously came out with that big statement a couple of weeks ago asking for forgiveness. He deserves to ask for forgiveness. I mean, the people of South Sudan need a break from this war.
Indeed. I just hope that 2017 will give us kind of some different story to cover.
Absolutely. We need better stories than war stories, yes.
Well, now let's switch gears here. There were nearly 20 presidential elections in Africa in 2016. Former African Union Chairman Jean Ping, an ally turned critic of Gabon's President Ali Bongo, hoped to break the ruling party's nearly 50-year grip on power. He lost. Ghana and Benin stood out as the most peaceful and democratic, while Uganda was mired by violence as President Yoweri Museveni won another term, extending his 30 years in power. Gambia's elections results remain disputed. Well, now another story. The election thing. Every year, every time we have an election in Africa is a tense moment. Now we have 20, close to 20 in total. Why are you surprised by any? Salim, did anything come out possibly surprise you in a good way or a bad way?
Well, what we're seeing in Africa, I think, the era of strong men is somewhat in decline, where, constitutions have been amended. You see, even today, Burundi's Nkurunziza was addressing a crowd, and he said he is considering to run in 2020, and verbatim he says, if that's what the people want. We've seen this before. Rwanda is one example we can think of. But I think that, this farcical, stereotypical understanding of what African leadership is like, strong men holding power for a very long time, I think we're seeing an end to it because the people are really understing. I don't know. I'm trying to be as positive as possible.
He doesn't seem to agree. We know that Benin, we know that Ghana maintained its character.
Exactly.
We expected that.
The positive
Jackson says, well,
there are very many examples to draw from. Uganda. There were so many almost presidents in this past year.
That's
there
true.
were elections. There are signals that there's progressive elements in these governments. However, when you look at the elections in Uganda, the shutdown of social media, the presidential candidate who supposedly, many say that won the election, but has been in perpetual house arrest for how many months after Jean Ping in Gabon, another almost president. Then the creme de la creme, the story of Gambia, the man winning, losing an election, calling his opponent and conceding defeat,
and then
we're all very happy with say we have a happy moment. 2016, one of those feel-good stories about political feel-good stories in Africa was Gambia, the president Yahya Jammeh picking up the phone on TV and making calling Barrow his opponent and say I concede defeat. 1 week later,
change his mind. We
changes his
almost got
mind.
a pleasant surprise. Let's get your final word from you on this.
But you can't really pass the DRC Congo, which is a very,
absolutely.
very
It's a big
important,
story, yes.
big country to look at. You know, if you think about stereotypical understanding of what African leadership looks like, of course, Burundi and DRC Congo come to mind. You see, President Kabila saying that he's not going to, positioning himself for
he has
a third
1 more year in
term.
power.
Exactly, and then it shows that
elections.
it has more consequences. The EU and the US imposing sanctions on inner circles of Kabila. But aside from that, I remain optimistic. Even when Yahya Jammeh says, I am going to.
Who knows? Maybe it will surprise us the beginning of the year.
Exactly.
But you know what?
Vincent, ECOWAS. We need to give it up to ECOWAS, by the way.
We'll wait
We'll
for what they say after that. Well, Salim and Jackson, VOA correspondents here, we want to thank you very much. The excellent insights so far on Africa. We want to take a break now. Well, in Friday's business news, U.S. stocks ended on a positive following the worst start in history. Will 2017 carry the same momentum? Well, let's see what Africa 54 business correspondent Jill Malandrino has to say from the NASDAQ headquarters in New York.
In 2016, stocks have enjoyed the Trump bump. Just take a look at that action from the November election to where we are right now. And this is on bets that he would introduce tax cuts, deregulation, and higher infrastructure spending that would spur economic growth. So the first 100 days of his presidency will be what we call a show me period, and we could see some volatility around that since campaign rhetoric and what's actually put to practice are two very different things. Outside of Trump in 2017, longer term, the economy is picking up. We're seeing earnings growth, we're seeing stable valuations and mid to late cycle growth. That could lead to a continuation of the soon-to-be 8-year-old bull market and likely lead to mid to single-digit equity returns in 2017. We also have to pay attention to what happens with the U.S. dollar, as that has enjoyed some impressive strength. Dollar fluctuations impact earnings, especially the major global conglomerates like a General Electric, for example, and overall trade and commerce. Commodities have been mixed. We have crude oil over 50, while gold has been selling steadily. Just like the equity markets, there will be movements in asset classes across the board. And I think 2017 promises to be just as interesting as 2016 was. From the NASDAQ market site in New York, I'm Jill Malandrino, and this is Africa 54 Business News.
Well, thanks a lot, Jill. It's time now for a short break. Still to come on Africa 54, an exhaustive collection of traditional and popular African music goes digital. We'll be right back. Well, over the years, on Africa 54, we've paid tribute to VOA's legendary ethnomusicologist, Leo Sarkisian. For decades, Leo traveled across Africa and collected and created recordings for his weekly broadcast of Music Time in Africa, which first went on air in 1965 and still airs today. Now, those broadcasts from the past are now going digital, and audiences worldwide will have online access to them. Here to tell us more about the project is the current host of Music Time in Africa, Heather Maxwell. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's been a while.
Yes.
Yeah, so first let's just ask one question. This idea, where did it come from? It's a great idea, though.
To digitize the collection?
To digitize this collection.
It came from a small group of individuals from the VOA and the University of Michigan. So here at the VOA side, it was myself and my predecessors, Matthew Lavoie, who many of you remember was the host for a few years, and then Leo Sarkeesian. On the other side in University of Michigan, it was Professor Conway from the Information Sciences Department and Kelly Askew from the Anthropology Department. She's an expert in African music, and he is an expert in information sciences and how to preserve cultural heritage in a digital format.
Which is really great. And why is it important that people across the world should be able to access this music, some which were recorded like many, many decades ago?
Yes, well, it's important for many reasons. Number one, it is one of the world's greatest cultural resources. The first decade was in the 1965 to 75, which, as you know, was very important in African history when most of the sub-Saharan countries were becoming independent, and they were developing their own identities around their music cultures. So that is really important, that it's just a world resource, cultural resource. And then second, now American audiences worldwide can listen again for the very first time to these recordings that were recorded, were broadcast maybe one time.
And you know, I do take a lot of interest in old music, but you travel around too, across the continent. Do you get the sense that even the younger generation is curious about music like what we can listen to on this kind of program?
I definitely do. They, even if they're very young, they respect their traditions, even if they don't actually listen to it a lot. It's important. And the older I see music listeners and even musicians in Africa get, the more important their cultural heritage becomes. So it's very important, also as a resource for universities in the U.S., in Africa, as a tool to teach about their heritage.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And now, you inherited Leo Sarkeesian's big shoes. But one other thing I know, apart from hosting the music, you are yourself a musician, and we have mentioned that many times on this program. What were your major highlights, or what was your major highlights in the music scene this year that is ending?
Me as Heather Maxwell, the artist?
Yeah.
I would have to say the collaboration I did with Wino in Kenya.
Yeah.
You know a little about that.
I know about that.
Yeah, we did a great collaboration, and I think we featured this here a couple weeks ago when you were absent. A beautiful love song, and I was able to sing in English and in Luo. We made a music video, but it was just a studio version. So in 2000, that was the highlight for me personally, because I was in Nairobi, I met him, we had a great connection. The music is beautiful, and we're moving forward with it.
We'll talk about it come 2017.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Heather, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Right. Heather Maxwell of Music Time in Africa. You can also watch, log on to the Facebook and type in the keywords Music Time in Africa, and you can see what time a program can be heard in your area and get more information about some of our featured artists. And that's our show for today. Now be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. For more news, tune in to VOA's Evening Radio Show. And on that note, we want to wish you a good night.
Welcome to the Voice of America's Newswords.
This word describes a terrible disease.
Malaria.
We used to see a lot of malaria in Wangpa Clinic, but now with efforts of elimination and active surveillance, and even the setting up of malaria posts on the other side of the border, the malaria rates have really gone down.
Malaria. Malaria is an infectious disease that can be deadly.
An infected person has fever and chills. Malaria is found in hot and wet climates. It is spread by mosquitoes and can be prevented with medicine.
Now, when you hear the word malaria, you will know what this news word means.